We're doing this, I did this with my friend Mark Moyer, who's just joined the Trump administration, who's running an initiative that my friend Mark Kansian is maintaining for him on sort of drawing lessons from history and applying them to policies of today. And so he said, Dan, this is the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And we said, oh gosh, then we really ought to do something. It's not something to celebrate, frankly, but it's something we ought to remember. And so I think we need to remember it for a couple of reasons. One is that I think that the communist revolution in Russia was a reflection of the failure of various societies to deliver various sorts of public goods for their people. So if we're in, say, their social goods or political goods. And so I think that it's a warning to us today, and one of the reasons for us to do this event is to say, okay, well, if governments, democratically elected governments or less democratically elected governments, are not delivering goods, the UN uses language like accountable governance, that there's always the danger of a revolution. And so if you say, okay, well, what happened in Venezuela in the late 90s with Hugo Chavez, you'd say, okay, well, Hugo Chavez would say, if he was alive, he'd say, I'm the result of the failure of the political system in Venezuela. And so now you could say, if you look at where the road that Venezuela is going down, I would argue it's similar to communism. So it's one reason to do this is as a warning for governments of today, to the extent that they're not delivering the goods, that there's always the chance for a bad radical alternative to arise. And so that's one of the reasons to do that. The other reason is, I think that it's been very interesting wanting to hold this event. There's been sort of what I describe in sort of modern day parlance, there's been a disturbance in the force. It's sort of like you don't talk about anti-communism in polite company, or there's something sort of, you just don't talk about it, or it's not really something that's very in vogue to talk about anti-communism. And I think some of it has to do with that there's a continuing not complete satisfaction with democratic capitalism. I think some of it, if you look at the financial crisis of 2008 and others, that there have been, questioning of sort of democratic capitalism. Democratic capitalism has many things to criticize about it. I don't think the alternative, with the far worse alternative of a communist system, is the alternative, but some of it, I think, stems from that. This is sort of an ongoing critique and sort of dissatisfaction with democratic capitalism. So I think it's important that we're able to sort of recognize that these are real challenges, and so it's important. So we also wanted to frame this as, okay, well, what is development and what is communism? And so I think we spent a lot of time in international development circles thinking about, okay, what does that mean in terms of social, economic, and political development? And so I think there's been a long arc of changes and research and consensus say, well, there's several things you need for good international development. You need, in terms of things of raising wealth standards and human rights. It's generally free markets and democratic capitalism, so relatively well-governed societies and having some kind of a functioning private sector are the elements of a successful society with a functioning government, meaning a functioning social safety nets and other things like that. There's absolutely, I believe, a role for states in that. And so I think we have to, and so I think the other thing I would just say is I think that communism in the 20th century had benefited as it was a vehicle for anti-colonial sentiment. And so I don't think, thankfully, we sort of have gotten past that stage. So I think that isn't going to be an issue in the future. But I think these first two issues are sort of dissatisfaction with markets and free markets is going to continue to be with us, and the temptation of choosing a bad radical alternative, and then so then we need to remind governments that they need to deliver public goods for their people, or there can be problems like we've seen in places like Venezuela. So we have a very interesting panel. Romina Ben-Dur, who's a senior fellow here, is going to present some thoughts first to kick this off properly. And then we've got three really interesting panelists. Paul Kenger, whose book, The Crusader, about Ronald Reagan, is one of my favorite books. Thanks for being here. We have Laura Nicolai. We always talk at CSIS about we need to have diverse folks, and we need more young people. So Laura Nicolai is a college student at Harvard College, wrote a very important op-ed in the Harvard Crimson that I think you'll hear about and went viral, and she'll tell you about that. And then we have Marion Smith, who is with the Victims of Communism organization, and is going to, I think, also be able to, is going to share that perspective as well. So I'm going to ask the panelists and Romina to come up, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Romina. Romina, over to you.
Thank you, Dan, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here and attending this important event. I realize it's Friday and this is not the most uplifting topic, so I thank you for your presence. As Dan mentioned, this is a joint event with the Project on Military and Diplomatic History. I thank the program team for being here, and also huge thanks for our researcher, Brunilda Costa, who put the paper together. She couldn't be here today, but she's here in spirit, so we'll share that paper in about two weeks. As Dan mentioned, I have a 10-minute presentation, and then we'll have an hour discussion with our distinguished panelists. But before I start, I'd like to see from the audience who in the audience has friends or family that escaped communist regimes or are victims of communist regimes. Please raise your hand. Okay, thanks. So especially for you, thank you for being here. So we'll start with some definitions. Oops. Okay. So let me start with a few definitions. This is definition by Richard Pipes. What is communism? He refers to communism to three phenomena: an ideal, a program, and a regime set up to implement that idea. So the ideal of communism is full social equality that is in the most extreme. Then in the most extreme form calls for the dissolution of the individual in the community. The program or plan was laid out in the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848. They laid out a theory of history as a struggle between economic classes, which will inevitably come to an end through a violent overthrow of capitalist society. Following this communist revolution, Marx argued that workers would take control of the means of production, and after a period of transition, the government would fade away, and workers will build a classless society based on common ownership, and production and consumption would reach an equilibrium. Religion and the family, they viewed as institutions of social control that were used to subjugate the working class. Those institutions would go away, as well as government and private ownership. And the first attempt to install this ideology was in Russia by Lenin, and which lasted until 1991. On the other hand, we view development, there are many definitions of development, but the most, I guess, famous is the one by Amartya Sen, development as freedom. Amartya Sen looks at human development, it's not only about economic factors or economic growth, but it should also include political freedoms, access to social institutions, economic opportunity that expands citizens' capabilities. And in this spirit, the UNDP Human Development Index takes Amartya Sen's approach. We have a definition of development which denotes domestically driven economic and social progress encompassing economic growth, political freedom, improvements in health, human rights, literacy, education, and other quality of life measures. To give you some context of what we're talking about, and I'm sorry for historians, this is a lot of history in one slide, but so to give some context, 1848, the Communist Manifesto is published in London. That's the backbone of modern communist theory. 1917, there are two revolutions in Russia. The first one overthrows the Tsar. The second one throws the Kerensky provisional government, and there's a period of big turbulence. The Bolsheviks were not successful. They had to go through a civil war, the Reds versus Whites, and finally then they managed to control Russia. In 1922, the USSR was formed. In 1949, the People's Republics of China was formed, also a communist state. 1947 through 1991, the Cold War period. Then we have the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the USSR, and in October of last year, it's been 100 years of this Bolshevik coup d'etat. Now, the highlights of, some highlights of this paper that we're publishing. This paper, it takes a lot of the historical literature and secondary sources. It's meant to be a summary of what has been the economic performance, social and environmental of the USSR, but also it highlights what misinformation we have today about this ideology, and also what institutions emerged to counter communism. For example, the World Bank and regional development banks were institutions that were formed after the Second World War and to counter in great extent communism, and even the building we're in, CSIS, was formed in 1962 during the Cold War period. Now, interesting information is the level of information that people have about this regime. This is from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. These are polls that they did. Approximately 1 in 4 Americans and 1/3 of millennials believe more people were killed under George W. Bush than Joseph Stalin. 70% of all Americans and nearly 60% of Generation Z believe that more people were killed under Hitler than Stalin. And many millennials are unfamiliar with communist leaders. Another piece of information, polls in Russia by the Levada Center show that 58% of Russians regret the collapse of the Soviet Union and 52% think it could have been avoided. And last year, a poll came out saying that Stalin is regarded as the most outstanding figure of all time in a Russian poll. Now, if we want to talk about development, human development, we'll start with people and humans. So this is from the Courtois books of 1998, the Black Book of Communism. And these are victims of communist regimes. It's estimated, it is an estimate. The estimate is that these regimes have killed 100 million people, mostly in China, from processes like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And these are not war victims. These are victims of man-made famines, repression, prison camps. You probably heard the Gulag. So we just wanted to showcase those numbers. And of course, there are critics that say, oh, these are they're overstated. Okay, if we cut 50% of them, it's still like 50 million. So that's a lot of people that died in the hands of this regime. Some pictures that we got authorization to showcase. This is the first man-made famine in Soviet Ukraine in 1921. As you see, they did target children as well. And the human cost in terms of mass shootings of political prisoners, but by the NKVD. This is a picture from 1941. And I want to point out this picture. We have Che Guevara, who was, of course, responsible for, one of the main responsibles for the Cuban Revolution. He's an Argentine doctor, and there's this, when I came to the United States, I was really surprised at the magnitude of his image through college campuses. And so you probably see his face in a lot of T-shirts. I have a problem with that image. I don't have a problem with this one, because in this one you can see it's the same face, but behind it, it's all the victims that, all the people that he is responsible for murdering. So Che is not really hip. That's the idea. And this, thank you for the Young Americas Foundation for this image. So let's talk about the, statistics, economic and social statistics. This chart shows the three types of data collected by official Soviet statistics, CIA, and an official Soviet. There are two things. Obviously, the official Soviet statistics were overrepresented, but there's also another trend here that is the decline of economic growth in the Soviet Union throughout 1950 through 1980s. If we compare, let's say, GDP growth, this is from the Madison database, GDP growth per capita from 1912 to the fall of the Soviet Union, both for China and the USSR, you see that US outperformed. And an interesting piece of data is we compared Japan in 1914. Japan had a very similar per capita income as the USSR, but it managed to grow to $19,000 in 1992, while the USSR stayed at about 5,000. So there are more economic figures. I just wanted to highlight some of this. In terms of the Gini coefficient, yes, the USSR had a lower Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient measures inequality. So the Gini for the USSR in the 1990s was about 0.3. A higher Gini means more inequality. A lower Gini, closer to 0, means perfect equality. And the US had a 0.45. So yes, it was more equal society, but they also had a poverty rate that was 14%. It was 40 million people were poor in the USSR. So it was not, a perfect egalitarian society. In terms of social performance, the Soviet Union did achieve a high enrollment rate, but education was viewed as a tool to serve the Marxist-Leninist framework. A lot of the other topics like humanities and language programs were very restricted, and there was a very big push for science, engineering, and technical specialties. Women did get higher degrees in engineering throughout the years, but they still made lower wages and were not in very significant posts. And of course, one key aspect of Soviet performance was full employment. Yeah, there was zero unemployment according to the USSR. Again, this is a figure of the Gini coefficient. What's interesting to note is that the Gini coefficient actually went up in the 80s during Gorbachev. There's a book by Scheidel who says that Gini coefficients did fall. They were lower than in the Tsarist period, but still, the USSR did not achieve perfect equality, which was the Marxist doctrine. So finally, why does communism retain still attraction today? Some of the reasons are lack of awareness among youth about these human horrors. There's a distortion of history. People remain dissatisfied with the market economy, and they believe other alternatives are better. And some people still think that communism was a good cause, and they argue that the problem was really the implementation and not the theory. So this is my short presentation, and now I invite our distinguished panelists to come up to the podium, to the tables, please. Okay, so I have the pleasure to moderate this panel. We have Marian Smith, who is the Executive Director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Marian Smith is a civil society leader, expert in international affairs, and he has been the ED of the foundation since 2014. And as Executive Director, he provides strategic leadership and spearheads its educational initiatives. Next to me is Paul Kengor. Professor Kengor is a professor of political science at Grove City College and executive director of the college's Center for Vision and Values. He's a New York Times best-selling author of over a dozen books. Dr. Kengor is an internationally recognized authority on several subjects, particularly Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, communism, conservatism, and progressivism. Dr. Kengor has authored several bestsellers. And last but not least, we have Laura Nicolae. She's a student at Harvard College, and she's the daughter of 2 Romanian immigrants. She studies applied mathematics and economics at Harvard College with a minor in political philosophy. She's the co-president of the Harvard Libertarian Club and is the daughter of Romanian immigrants. Her father escaped from the Romanian communist regime in 1988, and she recently wrote a viral op-ed, 100 Years, 100 Million Lives, Think Twice. In which she critiqued her peers' acceptance of communism. Her op-ed was one of the most read pieces in the Crimson in 2017 and was featured by the Wall Street Journal. So here we have our panel, and I want to kick it off with Professor Kengor. Why do you think communism was attractive in the first place?
I got to say the sprint mode. Is it okay? Hit the button. Okay, great. And thank you for inviting me here, and Dan as well. I got to say this, if you'll indulge me in this. I was at CSIS from 1991 and 1993 when it was on 1800 K Street. I worked at Paul Mill for Bill Taylor, and I loved Bill Taylor. And Jim Blackman, Don Snyder, great group. And so started there as an intern, and then it's my first full-time job after going to American University. So I have many great memories of CSIS. And I had no idea the building had moved either. So that was, it's been a few years, obviously. But yeah, that question, it's a good question. I mean, how popular was communism ever? I mean, it's certainly in Bolshevik Russia, it was a revolution, and it required a civil war after that. The revolution was October, November 1917, then immediately there's a 3-year civil war, 1918 to 1921. W. Bruce Lincoln, The History of the Russian Civil War, says about 7 million men, women, and children died in that war. So they went straight from, and then from that into a system that from 1922 until the 1980s, you put up the Courtois book, the Black Book of Communism, the Harvard University Press book, says that the Soviet Union was responsible for the deaths of 20 million people. That's a conservative figure. I mean, and you're right to use it. I mean, and a lot of us do use it. We go with that. But some of the latest research, Alexander Yakovlev, who was Gorbachev's right-hand man and principal reformer in the Soviet Union, he did a book for Yale University Press, 2002, and he said that, quote, Stalin alone annihilated 60 to 70 million people. That's what Yakovlev claimed. And Yakovlev was given the job in the 1990s of trying to actually calculate the number of deaths with the opening of the archives. And those figures also said 65 million dead for China under Mao. The latest book by Zheng Chang, John Holliday, and some others have at least 70 million dead. So you could have 130, 140 million dead just from China and the Soviet Union alone, which would be more than double the combined death totals of World War I and World War II. It would be 5-6 times the number of people killed in the influenza epidemic of 1918, 1919. So there's really literally no more lethal ideology in all of history. How popular was it? No communist government, or very few, they don't hold elections. And why don't they hold elections? Because they lose. Fidel Castro, here around the corner at the National Press Club, I guess it's not right around the corner, April 17th, 1959, promised free and democratic elections. He said, democracy is my ideal. And he promised that to Lawrence Spivak on Meet the Press at the time, and we are still waiting 59 years for those free and fair elections. If the Castros felt that they could win an election, especially with 89% in this wildly popular island of this magical free healthcare and education, they would hold it. They would hold it in a second. They had to, communism was so popular in Eastern Europe that they had to build a wall to keep people from escaping. Cap Weinberger told me, he said, anytime you ever speak to, and he was Reagan's Secretary of Defense, he said, anytime you ever speak to an audience and mention the Berlin Wall, make this promise, do this for me. He said, in which direction did the East German guards patrolling the Berlin Wall point their guns? East. They didn't have to look west. Nobody was coming in from the west. So that was a wall to keep people from escaping. Another figure, I think 150,000 dead in Latin America under communism. About 100,000 people, and this is out of the Black Book of Communism too, minimum of 40,000, probably 100,000. About 100,000 people have tried to swim from Cuba to Florida. It's 100 miles. Tried to swim 70 to 100 miles. And about 40,000, we estimate, have drowned in the process. So that should be included in those figures. 100,000 compared to 0, which is the number of Americans who've tried to swim to Cuba. All right, so this is not a popular ideology. It's always been implemented at the tip of a bayonet. Ask anybody in any Eastern European country, including your parents, right? And they'll tell you that. So I could stop there. I go on and on. Just push the button on the back on my back, and I can stop and go. But
I don't know if Marion, you or not allowed, I want to comment on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say I definitely echo those remarks that it's never been popular by the people who actually lived under those regimes. Starvation isn't fun. Repression, surveillance, those aren't things that people do or participate in as hobbies. Obviously, those are forms of suffering, and that is something that people who have lived through communist regimes very much recognize, but that's very different from the kind of rhetoric that you hear about communism today. So, I'm a college student, I go to Harvard, and a lot of the rhetoric that I hear about communism at Harvard is a lot of jokes about how, we should just start another revolution, jokes about how I used to call myself a liberal, but I would never call myself a communist because communism killed people. But now, in the previous 2 years, I'm a communist now. I think we should kill more people, overthrow capitalism, things like that, which is very different rhetoric than the rhetoric of the people who have actually survived communism. And growing up with hearing stories of my parents or of my family and their friends, people who disappeared. My dad's childhood friend who was 11 and wrote something bad about Ceausescu, the dictator, on the bathroom wall in the 5th grade and then mysteriously disappeared. Those stories don't give you the luxury growing up to be able to joke about it as if those numbers are nothing. They're not abstract ideals and abstract things that happened to people, numbers of people in the distant past anymore. They are concrete people and a concrete human cost. And that's why I really like the picture of Che Guevara that Romina put up, because that's really the epitome of the divergence between this idealism about the future of humanity versus the actual things that happen to real humans. Che Guevara wrote a lot about what his vision for the new enlightened man was, about how humanity would transform after the socialist revolution, but he also urged people and his supporters to become cold-blooded killing machines and said that he wanted another Vietnam. And so while he may have had some views about the future of humanity and how it would turn out perfectly, he didn't care about the real humans that were living at that time. And I don't think that those two things can be reconciled. And I think remembering that there were real humans who have stories, who can tell those stories, and who actually suffered, those stories are more realistic and will tell you the truth about what actually happened in those regimes. And I think that would help make this picture of communism a lot more concrete and hopefully combat some of the rhetoric that we hear about it today.
Well, thank you, Romina and Dan, for the invitation. It's an important conversation, and I'm glad to be here and a part of it. Paul, it's good to see you. Paul helped us several years ago design our high school curriculum supplement to help teachers in the classroom in high schools teach the very difficult history of communist regimes and the Cold War. And it's also very nice to meet Laura today. And congratulations on that wonderful op-ed you published. Probably wasn't the most popular op-ed that the Harvard Crimson has ever published, but certainly one of the most courageous. And what has been said, I'm glad we've covered the numbers. That's very important. And there's a lot about the numbers, and there's a lot about the details of how political prisoners were tried and killed, either judiciously or extrajudiciously, because we still have existing communist regimes who obscure the record and the history. And in places where we thought we had seen the last of communism and might have a healthy moral reckoning about its past, we see the closure and the corruption of archives and a whitewashing of the historical record. And so what we're doing here today is difficult, but it is absolutely necessary. My organization, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, was authorized by a unanimous act of Congress in 1993 to educate Americans about the history of communist regimes and to memorialize the victims. Our chairman, Lee Edwards, and Lev Dobryansky, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and a few others led the charge to have a moral reckoning in this country because America did, for many decades, fight international communism. We spent more blood and treasure than any other country in the world trying to contain a system of government that, despite the rhetoric of equality, brought a new form of slavery to the world. And it's important that in 2007 we dedicated a memorial. President George W. Bush dedicated it. It's a bronze replica of the Goddess of Democracy statue that the student protesters in Tiananmen Square in 1989 erected. And that stands at the corner of New Jersey and Massachusetts Avenue here in Washington. And it's a place where leaders or dissidents come and lay a wreath on behalf of their fellow countrymen or families who suffered at the hands of these governments. And since 1917, it's been some 40 national experiments in Communist Party rule. And in every case, it's either turned into a totalitarian police state or collapsed economically. And that's a pretty good record. It's near perfect. And I think, and Romina, you mentioned the poll that we conducted in 2016 and 17 that shows, unfortunately, a staggering lack of awareness of this record historically and an understanding of the human cost of these experiments in Marxist government. And we found a few months ago that a majority of millennials, so people under the age of 35 in this country, would prefer to live in a socialist system than a capitalist system. The same poll also found that overwhelmingly they don't understand what these terms mean. So it's very clearly a failure of education, but it leads to some absurd things. We've already mentioned the Che Guevara t-shirts that we see on college campuses. It's really quite ironic that you would have activists for racial justice wearing a t-shirt of Che Guevara, or LGBT rights activists wearing a t-shirt of Che Guevara, and thinking that the Cuban Revolution was somehow more equitable or just than our own society, imperfect though it may be. When the fact is, Che Guevara killed gay people because they were gay. He killed black people in Cuba because they were black. He's not a hero. He's been romanticized by American academics, by popular culture, by Hollywood. And we have to come to terms with why there's a double standard in our own country, our own society, We have rightly condemned the crimes of Nazism. We have understood that a flawed understanding of racial justice, such as the Nazis represented, can lead to horrific episodes of human misery. But we haven't yet come to terms with how a flawed system of economic justice can lead to unimaginable suffering and, on a scale, as Paul has detailed, unprecedented in human history. But this lack of awareness also leads to another thing. It leads to the fact that in this century so far, we have seen the colonization of Venezuela by the Communist Party, the Castros in Cuba, and the democratic socialism, quote unquote, that was represented by the Hugo Chavez movement, and now the caretaker is Maduro, and he's continued the experiment. I think a lot of young people don't even know how to understand what's happening in Venezuela. We've dealt with, in the last 4 years, trying to help people understand that nothing economically or legally has been reformed in Cuba. So how can we understand that if things are supposed to be getting better in Cuba, we're seeing a slow burn dictatorship be established in Venezuela, and we certainly aren't doing anything about it. So this conversation is high time to be had. And thanks for hosting it.
Thank you, Marian. I have a follow-up question. How do you respond to people that say, well, it was a great idea in theory, but the problem was its implementation? Because I hear that a lot, especially when we put together this event. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Go ahead.
Me? Okay. Well, they should read the book. I mean, I get that all over the country. Students who say communism is a pretty good idea if you just read the Communist Manifesto. And I mean, I already know the answer to my question. I say to them, oh yeah, have you read it? They haven't read it. They haven't read it because, and they should, because it's a very short book. I mean, you could read it easily in a few hours. Part 2 of the book, which part 1 is often usually read more, but part 2 says the entire theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. And then it doubles down on that. It repeats it a couple times. You charge us with wanting to abolish private property, we plead guilty. And it says, and I mean, right then and there, anybody knows, I mean, there is nothing more basic than the right to property. I mean, it's from the cave to the courthouse. You know, all different human societies. If you get into the project of trying to abolish private property, you're going to have to kill probably 100 million people. I mean, it's just impossible. And which reminds me too, this point on equality. Communists really don't believe in equality. Every communist society, you'll have people, about 90% of them equally poor. And then Fidel Castro every year was listed by Forbes magazine as one of the top 10 wealthiest dictators in the world. Castro was worth billions in property alone when he died. So everybody in the entire island was set at a certain fixed salary, everybody from doctors to janitors to teachers to baseball players. And then you had Fidel and Raul and a close group of apparatchiks who ran the island, owned the island. It's true in every communist society. There's no exception to this. You know, it's always communism's for the ruled, not the rulers. It's for the masses, not the masters. Everybody, the Soviet Union, right? They had the leaders had their dachas on the Black Sea. Read Gorbachev's memoirs on this. Read William Taubman's new book on Gorbachev. It's about 850 pages long, talking about the dacha that Gorbachev had. It was like a palace. You know, so it was always, you know, everybody else was equal, but you know, some were more equal than others, as Orwell would say. It was, so there wasn't equality. It's never been like that. But if you just go through and you read the Communist Manifesto, the 10-point plan that they lay out, that's another thing you hear from people who are sympathetic. Oh, well, these communist countries, they haven't really done communism right. Really? Which of the 40 different varieties that have been tried? Any of them getting close to it? And Lenin insisted that he was the gatekeeper. He totally understood it. Read Lenin's book, The State and Revolution. He laid out in there exactly how they were doing Marx. Just read the Communist Manifesto. There's a 10-point plan. Abolition of private property, abolition of all right of inheritance. What hypocrisy in there, because that's how Marx and Engels had all their money, it was from inheritance. They gave a very specific 10-point plan. They called for abolition of the family, which is an amazing statement. In fact, the exact line is abolition of the family, exclamation mark, even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. They wrote that in 1848. It was already considered an infamous proposal of the communists. So just read the book. I mean, Lenin and these other guys, I think, implemented exactly what they were supposed to implement. But you find out when you try to take away people's private property and basic civil and human rights, from speech to religion to you name it, you're going to have to kill 100 million people.
I have a two-part response to this idea that it was just the people were bad, the system is fine, or it's good in theory, but it was bad in practice. First, obviously, I think we can all speak to this. It's not good in theory either. A lot of people that I talk to who are sympathetic toward communism are students who have read the Communist Manifesto or read political philosophy and study it and, have their noses in their books and thus think that these ideals sound really good. But I study quantitative economics, and Marion mentioned that there's almost a perfect correlation between communist governments and economic collapse or repression and death. And economists know that if you control for variables, like you take out some of the people who are leading the governments and you input others and you get the same result, it's not primarily the fault of the people. And so that is a way to avoid the bigger question of why the system is constructed in such a way that it allows bad people to have power and to produce those results. And I mean, so there are numerous theoretical flaws, but just to name a few, the idea that by state fiat you could abolish the fact that humans are self-interested, that has never worked. I mean, show me the organism that is not motivated by survival instinct. It doesn't exist. The reason that we revere saints or people that we think are selfless is because we view that as a virtue because it's rare, because most people are self-interested. And so if you think that you're going to override that fact about most humans by state fiat and then give a centralized government a lot of power to use force to force the results they want when it doesn't work, you should not be surprised that that ends in repression and collapse. Also, the fact that individuals have different interests. People value things differently. Exchanges happen on the free market because I value this table and you value your money, and so I'll buy your table and you want my money. But if you abolish that free enterprise system, that's a peaceful way to make our interests coincide and negotiate out our interests. But if you can't do that, then nobody's really happy. No one's interests magically just become the same just because you've said that they should be by state fiat. And that's why communism collapses. That's a few of the reasons. But the second part is that even if we didn't have any idea of why communism is bad in theory, even if we didn't know the economic theory or these facts about how humans function, the fact that 100 million people died due to the ideology should be a warning bell that something about the theory is wrong. Even if we couldn't hypothesize what exactly that was, the results should tell us that it's probably not a series of coincidences. And that means that my peers who are, reading political philosophy and haven't really thought of any of these hypotheses for why it might be wrong, and so they're like, oh, this is cool, this sounds good, I support this. If they recognize that those 100 million deaths happened, and they continue to think that we should go ahead with this theoretical ideal, then that is a gamble that they are willing to make on millions of lives on the chance that the next time the theory will turn out right. And that's not a gamble that I'm willing to make, but if someone is willing to make that gamble, they should at least understand that that is the gamble that they're making, and there are trade-offs, and those 100 million deaths did happen. And so ignoring that fact is not going to make the theory any better.
Yeah, I mean, communism in theory fundamentally denies the reality of human nature. How can we expect that it can be a system that can provide for human flourishing? In contrast to the theorists of the Free Society, John Locke, Adam Smith, Montesquieu, James Madison, who took humans as they are and tried to form and fashion a government that would provide for their flourishing. Marx and Engels came up with an ideology and a form of society and government, and then set about the task of fashioning humans to match that vision. And that is what has played out. I think it should be no great surprise that many of the true believing Marxists were some of the first to run afoul of communist parties in power, because they were trying to hold them to a standard that was above brute power itself. And so those were some of the first to be killed in the purges and sent to the gulags. But nevertheless, I don't think Stalin, for example, was a true believer. But they certainly understand that by killing God and removing any moral authority higher than the power of the state, you've got yourself an enabling ideology of tyranny. And so they're not going to stop using the rhetoric and the values, the ethics, the code speak of Marxism, Leninism, or Maoism, or any iteration of Marxist thought, because it, after all, is their claim of justice. When someone says, why do you have the legitimate authority to be governing? That's still what they appeal to. And a case in point here would be the interesting way in which the state media in the People's Republic of China this week has been celebrating the 170th anniversary of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. I'll just quote one People's Daily op-ed from yesterday. Or not an op-ed, I think there were only editorial pieces, no opposing editorial pieces. But it says that the Communist Manifesto, quote, represented a glorious dawn in human spiritual history and a spiritual home for communists. And so it's interesting that Xi Jinping, as he has said about, also I don't think he's a true believer, but he certainly has said about, killing off opponents in the party and using the ideology of Marxism and Maoism as a rationale for purging key posts in government ministries, the military, media, the academy. And so I think we have to just take seriously the interplay between these obviously failed ideas of communism and how they continue to justify governments totally controlled by communist parties in 5 remaining governments of the world in which 20% of the world's population today live. I don't think any serious analyst, be they an economist, an IR scholar, a political scientist of any stripe, I don't think they could get away with trying to understand the strategic culture of the United States or our politics or, for example, the NATO alliance without taking seriously our claims of justice and our common values. So it's not actually serious when you have people trying to understand what's going on in North Korea or in China, and they don't want to address at all the history, the ideology, the legacy of communism. Ideas do have consequences.
So following up on, the legacy, and we saw those polls. Why is there such romanticizing still with this ideology, and what do you think can be done, to deter these things? Also, you mentioned Hollywood. I haven't seen one, movie that's against communism. The Gulag Archipelago would be a great example, that could be made into a movie, or one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich. I haven't seen it, in the movies. So why is it, and especially in the Western world, Western intellectuals, why is this romanticizing?
Well, Marion's group affirms a lot of what I've seen, which is a lot of the young people, millennials, who say positive things about communism. When you really ask them to define it, they don't really fully understand it. You could tell that they don't know enough about it. They haven't really learned about it. But aside from that, too, and I'll just be candid about these things because I think we need to be, but a lot of people on the political left have certain find certain areas of commonality or similarity or sympathies without being pro-communist. They're not pro-communist, but they like some of the things that communism teaches. The idea of equality, the idea of workers' rights, some of the broader utopian economic ideas. And again, it doesn't mean that they're communists, but they'll be sympathetic to some of the ideas. Whereas on the other hand, there's no sympathy there at all for other extremist ideas like fascism, for example. So it's real easy for them to go after and attack fascism, but they simply don't seem to get outraged about it. I think that's what it comes down to. And also, too, I find in the academy, and Richard Pipes, the great Harvard professor emeritus of Russian history, used to say this a lot. It's not that the academy and other folks are pro-communist, but they are anti-communist. Think about that, anti-communist. They see anti-communists like myself as, well, kind of bores, kind of distasteful Neanderthals, you know, walking around complaining about communism. I mean, what kind of a McCarthyite troglodyte are you? You know, as FDR said to Martin Dies, the Democrat who ran the Dies Committee that became the House Un-American Activities Committee, Martin, you see a bugaboo under every bed. I'm telling you, I know communists. I've got communists that are friends. It's the fascists we need to worry about, Martin, the fascists. And Martin Dies was Joe McCarthy before McCarthy came along. And before Martin Dies, Alexander Mitchell Palmer, the great liberal for Woodrow Wilson, the Attorney General, he was Joe McCarthy. So they always seem to find their Joe McCarthy. I mean, it's kind of, not to make excuses for McCarthy, but they don't like the anti-communists. And so there's certain pro-communist sympathies, and they're anti-communists, so because of that, yeah, go try to raise $40 million in Hollywood to make a movie about Whittaker Chambers. I've been involved in these things. Not a chance. But on the other hand, plenty of movies like Schindler's List, The Holocaust, which there should be. But yeah, why no movie about the Gulag Archipelago? It's a great book. It came out a few years ago by a Romanian woman about women in Soviet prisons. You will cry all the way through that book. Some of the books, First They Killed My Father by Long Ung on Cambodia. A number of different, so many books on Cambodia. These are the books on Castro's Cuba. Why? And I think a lot of it has to come down to these political biases.
I would definitely echo that latter part about people are anti-communists. I wrote my article in the Harvard Crimson because of just like the rhetoric that I was witnessing, as well as the 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution. I thought it was a good time to say something and kind of create a disturbance in the rhetoric that I had been hearing. And after I wrote that article, it went viral really quickly, so for a while, there was all that anyone was talking about. And people really split into two camps. The first is, of people who had previously, been playing with the ideas of communism or had been sympathetic to it. So the first camp were the people who genuinely had their noses in their books and didn't know or didn't actually really mentally connect these ideologies with the 100 million deaths, and then realized that they had a friend or a peer who had, a family with experiences who had suffered under communism, and many of my other peers have as well. And they were like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that. I get why my rhetoric is, A, historically just disproven, but then B, offensive and rude to a lot of people. The second camp were the group of people who decided that because I had made a claim that should not be controversial, that communism killing 100 million people is a bad thing, that because I had said that, I must be a red baiter or a conservative or a fascist or something or other, and there were things floating around that said I supported Latin American dictatorships, loved poverty and climate change. I mean, I'm the co-president of the Harvard Libertarian Club. I don't like dictatorships, whether they're in Latin America or in Eastern Europe. I'm really not a fan of authoritarianism. And, you know, who is happy when people are poor? But obviously, it's like this idea that there's a dichotomy that if you are anti-communist, you must be pro everything else that's bad that they see as the direct opposite. And obviously, I don't think that that dichotomy exists, but it does to a lot of people, and people think that it is so polarized, which makes it difficult to make what should be an uncontroversial claim that an ideology killing 100 million people is bad. Like, an ideology killing one person is bad, and it shouldn't be controversial to say that. But because of this polarization, people saw that as automatic support for everything that they don't support, and it kind of turned into a lot more controversy than I thought that it merited.
On the question of film, popular culture, Angelina Jolie actually has just produced First They Killed My Father, I think on Netflix, right? There are films out there, some of which we review on our blog, victimsofcommunism.org. I think it's interesting to just look at a comparison to Holocaust studies and the wonderful work that the Jewish communities have done in helping us understand a terrible episode in human history and the interplay of power and ideas and also cowardice in letting that happen, and how we don't want anything like that to happen again. But if you look at when a lot of the Holocaust memorials and museums began to be established, it was roughly some 25 years after World War II, which we would count as the end of, obviously, the Holocaust. If you look at some of the efforts that have been happening in Europe and in the United States, I mean, maybe we're just on track if we take the fall of the Berlin Wall as the endpoint, at least, of communism in Europe. And I think there are, I guess, two main reasons that we see a greater interest in this now. One is a lot of the people who can tell their stories firsthand are passing away. We launched a new project called Witness, which is oral history videos trying to tell the stories of people who lived and survived a communist regime. And I think we've produced about 15 or 16 now, and at least one of those individuals has already passed away. So I think preserving these stories for future generations to learn the lessons, the way we have learned the lessons about Nazism and the Holocaust, is very, very important. But I would just say that, you know, those of us under 35, and certainly for myself, who are anti-communist, I'm against communism because I'm for things. I'm for human flourishing, prosperity, opportunity, human rights, the ability for those of us who are going to live most of our lives in the 21st century not to have to fight again a failed ideology that just happens to control way too much power on this earth. So I think what I'm motivated by are the stories that are happening right now in North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, China, and also courageous young people in Central Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union who are trying to tell the historical story, because it's involved with justice and truth, and it will set the parameters about what we view as acceptable political discourse in the free world. It's unbelievable to me that two of the most popular politicians in the Western world right now, Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders in the UK and the US, respectively, for decades represented what Bernie Sanders calls an independent foreign policy with the Soviet Union, who praised the Castros in Cuba, and more recently, both Corbyn and Bernie Sanders pointed to Venezuela as an example when asked, you know, you're talking about ideas and theory, where is it playing out? And they respond, Venezuela in the 2000s, in the first decade of this century, and now we've seen how that's played out. They haven't acknowledged that they were wrong. They haven't helped us overcome our complicity, frankly, in letting these regimes torment entire populations. These individuals and anyone else should be asked to explain why they haven't apologized for offering moral support to these regimes, why they haven't recognized the victims of these regimes. I don't want anyone who can't do that having anything to say about the future of our society. And we in the United States, which is not true for every country, even in Europe, but in the United States, being for a free society and against communism and fascism is a bipartisan endeavor, has been. 3 of the great anti-communist presidents, Harry Truman, JFK, Ronald Reagan, 2 Democrats, 1 Republican. You know, they started, fought, and ended the American side of the Cold War. If we have in one generation the issue of Marxism and politics become a partisan cause in the United States, we've lost something.
Thank you, Marion. We have a few minutes left for Q&A from the public. I believe you have little pieces of paper, no? Or, you know, just raise your hand and, or Sundar. And Dan, maybe you want to read them out and.
Can I ask the panel while we're putting the papers together on, I think one of the things that you have to respond to, because I think one of the other critiques out there is, well, what about, well, China's not so bad. That's a pretty good model. If someone says that to you, what is your response to that? Because I think one of the things that we've had, especially since the financial crisis, is, you know, that there was a significant whack to the democratic capitalism model, especially most recently with the financial crisis. And there was some questioning, especially around 2009, 2010. Well, I think that's kind of dissipated over time. How do we respond to that about, look at all the progress in quote unquote, the progress in China?
Well, China's a great example. I mean, Deng Xiaoping, about 30 years ago now, immediately started to decollectivize agriculture, started allowing for property rights, started
like things like capitalism.
That's right. And so I mean, China is more, if anything, politically communist than even economically, right? Because they've learned what they have to do in order to survive, in order to grow the economy. So you could see that with the repudiation of communism by some of those governments. I mean, the true, real communist dictatorships right now, right, Marion, would be basically North Korea, Cuba. And Venezuela is practicing what Hugo Chavez called 21st century socialism, which when you look at it and you see people lining up and hoarding toilet paper and running down to little grocery stores and buying everything off the shelf, looks a lot like 20th century communism, right? Doesn't seem to be all that big of a difference.
Let me just push on one other issue. So if you give, I think if you had supporters of communism here and they had a couple drinks in them, that said, well, you know, in addition to well, sort of there, some of the critiques of, well, if we had just gotten the right person to implement this, it would have been better. It's not really the horse, it's the jockey, is sort of the way academics talk about this critique. But they'll say, well, look at the social metrics of success. I'll put that in quotes. The social metrics of whether it's literacy or or health. How would this panel respond to that? Because it seems to me that's also sort of lingers out there.
I mean, it fails on its own metrics. But on the question of China, I mean, I would say we can identify 5 existing communist regimes: North Korea, China, Laos, Vietnam, and Cuba. And I think we have to understand that in places like Transnistria, it's essentially a Leninist state. Venezuela is now a single-party dictatorship, heavily influenced by the Communist Party of Cuba. China is interesting. It is a powerful communist state, if it is a communist state, and it is. The most powerful post in China is Secretary General of the Communist Party. And you don't have private property in China. State-owned enterprises and companies where the party or party-aligned businessmen hold the majority shares is not the same as a private company. Anti-corruption purges in China, although it sounds like a good idea here, are simply justifications to have the party have a better reputation in the provinces, or to get rid of senior party figures who are not in line with Xi Jinping's understanding of socialism with Chinese characteristics for the 21st century. Xi Jinping has made it very clear. He has gone in a more totalitarian, not just authoritarian, totalitarian direction than Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao had taken China. And they are very clear wherever they're operating, which very much looks like a neo-mercantilist imperial grand strategy, be it Latin America or Africa or other parts of Asia, Central Asia. They're very clear that they represent something different than the international rules-based trade system that we could say has existed since the end of World War II. And they're very clear that they don't accept individual rights as the basis of government. So if we want to deny that this is the reality, we're not contributing to stability and peace. We're creating instability. China very much believes, at least the current leadership of the People's Republic of China, very much believes in the rightness of their form of government. And for those who study international relations, when the PRC talks about harmony internationally, that can be understood as a very different concept than the American rules-based international system. So again, we've got to take it seriously. If they call themselves a communist party, they haven't rejected any of the tenets of communism, they have learned to replicate market mechanisms, but they also very tightly control any display of that in power. If you can disappear a billionaire in a Hong Kong hotel room, right, your socioeconomic status doesn't mean much. So freedom comes in a basket, can't be parsed out, and I don't see any promising signs from the People's Republic of China under Xi Jinping that they're embracing an open society as opposed to going back to a more Marxist interpretation of government.
I wanted to make a quick point on that latter part about social equality. This year, because it was the 100-year anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the New York Times was running a series called Red Century with a series of op-eds about the legacy of communism. And there were a few of them that made the point that life for women was a lot better under communism, and the labor ratios how many women worked outside the home or got educations were a lot better under communism. And I talked to some of the women in my family about those things, and they disagree with that thesis because yes, percentage-wise, women did work in equal numbers or get more equal years of education, which wasn't exactly education in communist societies, but that was all, of course, in the service of make sure that all of the population can be utilized as a labor force, because we have to make sure that our economy doesn't collapse. And given that we don't have things like free enterprise and investment and capital accumulation, we're going to have to make up for it with more labor. And that was the justification for making sure that you have your whole population employed, going to the engineering school to make sure that the railroads were working, because the state had to make sure those worked, because otherwise the state would lose legitimacy. Things like that produce the appearance of equality percentage-wise, but obviously the reason for that is not what it appears. And also, there were also some arguments about how women were perceived as social equals and in the eyes of fellow citizens were higher and better in communist societies, but there are plenty of women who were imprisoned in labor camps because they were wives or mothers of enemies of the homeland and had no sort of connection to anything that would be reasonably called a crime, but just by collective family guilt were imprisoned. And in Romania, where my parents are from, many women had to go to mandated monthly checkups at their place of employment to make sure that they were getting pregnant, because they had to keep having children, because otherwise the population would die out because everybody was starving, and that would mean that the state would lose its legitimacy, which was obviously not good. Ironically, that produced a baby boom of children who grew up and during 1989 were students and helped overthrow the communist government in the Plaza of the Revolution in Romania. And that was ultimately the ironic twist to the end of communism in Romania, but all of those reasons for why people think the lives of women were better in communism was ultimately just justified by greater state control and more repression.
By the way, you didn't mention my favorite of those Times articles, that women had better sex under communism.
I didn't want to mention that one.
And a friend of mine who was a border, worked at the Brandenburg Gate for the U.S. military, who used to watch the other side with binoculars, said, well, that makes sense to me because all the lights and electricity went out at nighttime. They didn't have anything else to do but have sex. Also, one of my favorites of the New York Times piece, they didn't mention this. One was on how great communism was for women in China, the country of the mandatory one-child policy. And here's a frightening statistic. China has 1/5 of the world's women. China has 56% of the world's female suicides. And that's been consistent for at least 20 years. Over half of the female suicides every year are Chinese. So it must be a damn great place for women over there, Joe. You know, bang up job by the New York Times on that one.
And to back up that point, I mean, in the PRC today, there are coercive family planning units with their own police force who enforce the child planning policy, which in some cases is one child and in some cases now 2, with all the necessary approvals and documentation and all of that. Otherwise, you're an undocumented person in China with no rights at all.
Sorry, you have to get a permission slip to have a second kid, right?
Correct.
If you want to have a third,
Well, I mean,
no, right?
You get fined.
this is officially what's happening, but what do you say to a family who has a forced abortion conducted on the mother in their home, whether or not it's regulatorily approved or not? I mean, what system justifies that? Some analysts think now that they would never get rid of this particular aspect of social planning coercively because it's a very powerful tool of the state. It's not normal.
I have a lot of questions here. I don't know where to start, but we're gonna. We don't have a lot of time left, but there's a question on Venezuela. In your opinion, how has Marxist ideology affected Venezuela? Can you talk about that, Marian or Paul?
Mary, go ahead.
Well, Chavez could come to power by basically a populist program of the reason you don't have as much money as you want is because of all of these capitalists and imperialists. And he was elected. He began eroding the rule of law in the country and allowed for squatters to take over property illegally. Venezuela for a while had one of the highest homicide rates in the world. Many of them overwhelmingly never investigated or proved because there was a lot of political killing going on. Because it wasn't yet a full command top-down communist state where you identified the undesirable class and go after them, but the political environment made it very clear. And so now they've nationalized the industry, they've chased out all of the capitalists and the imperialists, and now 20 years later, one of the wealthiest countries in the Western Hemisphere can't deliver toilet paper, basic food and medicine to the country. And that unfortunately, I don't think has fully permeated into the politics of Venezuela, that they went wrong with rejecting a rule of law, democratic, free enterprise society. But you did have at least 7.5 million people go voluntarily to the polls in a national rejection of the sham election that was just held by Maduro, in which he created an illegal assembly, the ANC, to replace the National Assembly. So what's happening right now is a country that would like to be in charge of its future. And Cuba and Maduro are conspiring to make it a single-party communist dictatorship. But they got into the post of power where they could start undermining the rule of law and ratchet it up based on a populist Marxist political program represented by Hugo Chavez.
I Googled one of my favorite quotes while you were talking. This is from Carlin, as an economics major, you're going to probably lose it here. Carlin Granadillo, who's the head of the price control agency in Venezuela, quote, "The law of supply and demand is a lie." How's that working out for him, right? The law of supply and demand is a lie.
Repeal it. Repeal self-interest.
Just
repeal the
repeal
law
it.
of supply and demand.
That's right. Yeah, go for it.
There's this question on leadership. What role do Western European leaders, specifically Angela Merkel, have in spreading democracy and free trade in Russia and Eastern Europe, and how have those relationships been compromised in the past?
Well, I do want to say one thing that really prompts. It's been a number of people have brought this up, but look at Western Europe. I mean, people are saying equality, and all the time you hear in America people referring to Cuba, isn't it great they have universal health coverage and high literacy rates? Look at Western Europe. You can get people universal health coverage and high literacy rates without a totalitarian communist police state. All right, there's ways to do this without implementing a Marxist dictatorship where 100,000 people try to swim to Florida while the government is flying over top with helicopters dropping sandbags on them. All right, you know, there are ways to do this, to achieve this goal without a Marxist dictatorship. So that's just a sorry excuse for what Cuba is doing. Oh, so they have universal health care? So there's other ways to do that. And by the way, people don't actually know what that means over there. What's the quality of health care, right? What's that actually like? High reliance on herbal medicine, acupuncture. I have a friend who goes to Cuba every single year as a missionary. They bring as much aspirin in as they can because people down there don't have aspirin. And for people who want to blame that on the embargo, that's errant nonsense. Cuba trades with every country in the world other than U.S. and Israel. It's not only, America doesn't have a monopoly on aspirin. Okay, they could get aspirin from somewhere else. So what's the quality of their universal health care?
That's a really good point. A high-tax welfare state is not the same thing as a communist state or even a socialist system. Right. That's a very important point to make. So if we want to have a national conversation about raising taxes and increasing welfare, let's do that. It doesn't have to be couched in a whitewashing of the history of socialism and communism.
Another question. People seem to have no trouble linking the ideology of Nazism to its disastrous consequences. However, when it comes to communism, people are less likely to associate the crimes of communism regimes to the ideology that enabled them. Why is that?
Well, I think it's a political ideological answer. They categorize Nazism as far right, and so thus they're more comfortable condemning it. Whereas communism, far left, they, again, because of certain sympathies, shared sympathies and goals, they don't want to condemn that like they do Nazism. But of course, Nazism on the economic spectrum, I mean, it was nationalism, socialism. I mean, Hitler wasn't exactly Ludwig von Mises, right, or Friedrich von Hayek. And ditto Mussolini, famous fascist. Mussolini was a Marxist. Lenin admired the writings of Mussolini. Said, well, Mussolini's really got it right. He really understands this well. So those are really, when it comes to government control and big government and also government control of the economy, it's hardly a free market idea. But either way, so they see Nazism as an ideology of the right. So it's, you know, full bore. You just you know, whack away at that. They have no hesitation whatsoever.
Just a quick point, I think that also part of this relates to the discussion about the abstracts and the ideals that we discussed earlier. The ideals and theory of communism are much more universally appealing. A lot of study in moral psychology recently splits moral theories into two basic camps, universalist or tribal or kinship systems. And like in-group, out-group defenses, if to the extent that those bonds are strong. And communism talks about equality for all humans, all people, like the masses. It doesn't explicitly make divides within people based on demographic categories, and so it sounds a lot more like our liberal Enlightenment rhetoric when we talk about human rights. And I think it's a lot more familiar for us as rhetoric than a lot of fascist rhetoric, which explicitly said, like, isolated a few groups of people and said, these people are bad, we are good, and we don't really ascribe to that, and our liberal tradition isn't, our rhetoric isn't very similar at all to that. So it's more easy for us, I think, to understand the ideals of communism and kind of think, okay, well, that doesn't sound too bad. And of course, I mean, that's the problem, and we discussed that earlier, but I definitely think that's part of it.
In my view, National Socialism and International Socialism are both on the totalitarian end of the political spectrum. And it is interesting to see, from a historical perspective, the way in which Nazis and Soviets conspired together, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, to start World War II. And for a year and a half, they cooperated. When Jews escaped the Third Reich into the Soviet Union, the NKVD rounded them up and turned them back over to the Nazis. Same thing for dissidents and political prisoners who escaped the USSR, the SS captured them, turned them back over. It wasn't until Hitler invaded the Soviet Union that all of the photoshopping began in the Soviet Union, and then they became anti-fascist. And unfortunately, I think a lot of our discourse about this is actually heavily influenced by decades of Soviet propaganda in creating this fundamental difference between fascism and communism, which intellectually and historically, just not really there.
You know, also Nazism was hatred based on ethnicity and race. Communism is hatred based on class. And so the Nazis would kill you based on your ethnicity. The communists would kill you based on your class. And Lenin said, we must teach our children to hate. Hate is the basis of communism. We must teach our children to hate their parents if they're against communism. But they, M.Y. Latsis, Felix Dzerzhinsky, they all talked about eliminating people on the basis of class. So it's just a different type of totalitarianism.
Of course, if you support either one of those ideologies, you don't have a difference in your fundamental principles. You still support hate based on something, and I mean, I would like to think that we would disavow that idea as a whole.
Well, I have many more questions, but we're out of time, and maybe some of you would like to approach the panelists later, but please join me in a round of applause to the panelists, and thank you for coming today.
Thanks.